Hey everyone, welcome to episode 81 of Wednesday Night Live. Hi Helen, Kristen, Sharon, welcome. We'll let some more people come in and we'll get started. I'm going to go over to YouTube and go live on YouTube. So give me one moment and we'll get that started and we'll let some more people come into the class. Okay, one moment. Hope everyone's doing well. Good to see you again. Okay, it looks like we're about to go live here on YouTube if the connection works. I know last week we had a little bit of a problem with that. Let's see here. See, we have some more people coming in. Hi, Sheila. Hi, Shirley. Welcome. And we're getting a little bit of a delay on YouTube, but I wanted to show you, I'm at a friend's place in New York, and it's an amazing view. I don't know if you'll be able to see this, but we're in Queens, right? Yeah. So we're in Queens, and I just want you to see the view of the city. I mean, is that, oh, can you turn the light out so they can see? Is that not incredible? Let me turn the light out so you can see this view. It's right across the street. Wow, look at that. And look at the view they can see. Yeah. Isn't that amazing? It's just incredible. Okay, all right. So welcome to the new people coming in. Here, let me, and I'm not sure if we're live on, looks like we're having trouble going live on YouTube. So I'm going to close that out and we'll just get started and I'll upload that afterwards. And welcome to the other people who have come in. Kristen said, it really is beautiful, isn't it? Okay. All right, so tonight we're talking about vitamin D and immunity. And as I always say, my goal in life really is for you to become your own authority in health so that you don't need to rely on people. You can make your own decisions for yourself. And I had a discussion with a friend of mine a couple of weeks ago who is shunning all supplements because there have been studies that have shown that when it comes to overall mortality in terms of your death rate, taking a vitamin D supplement has not been shown to reduce that. And unfortunately, what happens with the media is that they run with that story at the support of some other interests to denigrate and make it seem that supplements have no use. Now, we've spoken many times in the past about how there's a distinction between personal health, personalized medicine, and public health. And when someone is making public health policy suggestions, it could possibly be that because it doesn't reduce overall mortality, maybe someone who is specialized in public health would say there's no utility to that. But every time, but unfortunately for people as individuals, there are all kinds of situations, whether it's genetic issue or whether there's certain medical conditions, there are a whole host of things that can make it such that vitamin D supplement can be helpful. Now, we're obviously dealing with the current situation, which I'm not necessarily going to call it out, only because someone told me if I mention the words, then on YouTube, something happens on YouTube and you don't get as many views. But we all know what we're dealing with in terms of a virus and tonight we're going to talk about whether or not why it makes sense to take a vitamin D supplement or to optimize your vitamin D. Now, there are lots of things that go into vitamin D, and we're going to go through those as we go through the class. So let me share my screen and we'll get started. I hope the audio is okay. Okay, it looks like it's okay. Good. Okay, one moment. Having a little trouble here sharing my screen. Okay, there we go. All right, so as I said, tonight we'll talk about vitamin D and overall immunity. We'll talk a little bit about why deficiency in vitamin D is so widespread, I can't tell you. It's actually rare for me to test somebody's vitamin D level and for it to be normal. We'll talk a little bit about why that might be. Then we'll move on to some clues from epidemiology and giving us some understanding of what vitamin D is all about in terms of its relationship to immunity. We'll also talk a little bit about why it's difficult to study and get really strong positive results when it comes to vitamin D. And then we'll spend some time talking about why we even think that vitamin D should have any effect on the immune system. And then we'll move into how to raise your vitamin D level, what we're dealing with, the current situation, and why it makes sense that isolating vitamin D by itself makes absolutely no sense, which might sound like I've just contradicted everything I say, but as I've always described in our classes, the body is this incredible symphony of things moving together. And if you don't understand how things like vitamin D and magnesium interact with vitamin D, vitamin K and magnesium interact with vitamin D, then you don't have a real appreciation of what's an amazing, as I said, symphony of things moving together to make things optimally work in your human body. All right, so ultimately there's widespread deficiency. As I said, it's almost anyone I check vitamin D on is almost always deficient. And one of the reasons, of course, is urbanization, people living in cities, people not getting exposed to sun, darker skinned people moving to northern climates where people who have darker skin need more sun exposure to get the same amount of vitamin D. So if they're moving from an equatorial area up into the northern hemisphere, then there's going to be, unfortunately, less opportunity for people to develop to form vitamin D. So migration and urbanization, both of those have made a real difference in terms of why people have this widespread deficiency. Now, we know, probably all of you know, that when you think about vitamin D, you think most people, if you were to do a survey, would probably think of bone health as the first thing that when you think about with vitamin D. And we'll talk probably, that'll come up a little bit. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. But secondarily, it also is related to immune disorders. And actually, vitamin D by itself is not really a vitamin at all. It's actually a hormone. Now, vitamins and minerals work because they often act as what are called cofactors. And cofactors are things that are used secondarily to make something else go. In other words, if it's there are lots of things in the body that are one chemical reaction going to another chemical reaction. And for one chemical reaction to happen, you need a certain vitamin or a mineral to help that along. Vitamins work by hormones work through a different mechanism. They go into a receptor on a cell, they have a receptor on the cell, and then that communicates inside the cell. So it's actually very different from a vitamin. It is working through these receptors in your body. And so therefore, we really should probably not think of it at all as a vitamin. And lumping it into that also sort of allows pop media to sort of put it into the mix of vitamins and sort of to denigrate them in a way without doing it in a scientific way. So think about it as a hormone hitting receptors and activating things inside the cell. Now, we've spoken already about how this observation of ultraviolet light, when you're at a higher latitude, unfortunately, you're not going to be able to get the same amount of sun exposure, which is going to impact the amount of vitamin D that is going to be formed in your body. And there are a whole host of diseases, in fact, that increase with latitude. As you go north in the world, there are things like type 1 diabetes, inflammatory bowel disease, multiple sclerosis, asthma, something called vasculitis, which I see a lot in my practice, that increases as you go north. And one of the theories about this, of course, is that it's because of vitamin D. Now, the complicating picture is that unfortunately, you can't just give vitamin D and make these things go away. A lot of times, unfortunately, the damage has already been done and things have progressed to such an extent that correcting vitamin D at that point in time is not going to do anything. Likewise, unfortunately, there have been some studies in some diseases where they basically give people vitamin D to try to reduce the incidence, and the results are mixed with that, because you never know how far along something has gone. But we'll also talk about that complicating picture about just neglecting this symphony that we've talked about, which is where you really need magnesium and vitamin K to really fill out this entire thing. And unfortunately, when you do studies, you can't, it's almost always based on one ingredient, because modern medicine has developed in such a way that in order to get results, you really have to test one thing. You want that, modern medicine wants the magic bullet. And so when you apply that sort of notion or feeling to studying things like vitamin D, and you're neglecting the natural other things that go along with that, then it makes it difficult to come up with results that would, that would be like killer results, because you're neglecting the things that make it important by trying to find sort of that magic bullet. So this vitamin D and ultraviolet light, there's this mechanism, the two of them related when it comes to increased latitude going north, having less of that, and a whole host of diseases. So we've mentioned a little bit of the trouble of the challenge of these studies for the prevention of disease by supplementation of vitamin D have not returned. It's been very mixed. And again, the reason is, one, how long do you give it for? Is it too late? Have things progressed? Is the population too high a risk to start with, that one thing is not going to be enough? And then I would add, which will round out tonight's class, again, this ignorance of just, I would say, avoidance of taking into other factors like magnesium and vitamin K. So why do we even think that vitamin D affects the immune system? Well, as I said, it's a hormone. And so the hormone is interacting with the vitamin D receptor on the cell. And when it does that, it basically is communicating. It's sending it's like a lock and a key. And the key goes into the lock. And in this case, a door opens and you're able to then walk in and do what you want inside that room. Well, the same thing with the vitamin D. The vitamin D doesn't actually go into the cell, but it opens up and is sort of like relaying a message into the cell. And when that message is relayed, it does a whole host of things. It causes cells to do things. It's like a computer program, basically. And the password is the vitamin D fitting into the receptor like a lock and a key. And then when you turn that, it's like a domino effect, and a whole host of things happen that lead to some sort of cellular expression. And many of these are related to the immune system. A lot of these genes that get activated are in immune cells themselves. And some of these can actually locally convert vitamin D to its active form. So when the vitamin D needs to be in a certain place, it activates these cells in an area where you can get a whole lot of vitamin D formed to take care of what's going on in that area. Now, the immune system basically has two wings. They're called the innate immunity and adaptive immunity. Innate immunity is basically your first line of defense. It's like if you're in a war, there's that first line of soldiers that are just doing whatever they can to basically protect yourself. Now, remember, we have our skin that is sort of our first line of defense. We have our nasal membranes, and we have our GI tract. All of these are physical parts of our innate immunity, our first line of defense. And you can think about it that, like the war analogy, that as you go deeper into the soldiers, At the end point, there's a general who's making these decisions. And those decisions are really based on recognizing the defenses of recognizing who the enemy is, being able to identify the enemy, and then sending specialized missiles, let's say, that know where they're, like heat-seeking missiles, let's say, who know exactly where they're supposed to go. The first line of defense, the innate immunity, is basically just doing whatever it can in a non-specific way to provide defense. What's amazing is obviously with a virus or with a bacteria, the key is to not allow the bacteria or the virus to get into the body. And therefore, that innate immunity, that first line of defense, is going to be very, very important. And vitamin D, what that does is it regulates genes. It basically, again, it goes into the receptor like a lock and key, and then it turns on genes that activate, that create these proteins that create a tight seal around your skin, around your gut, around your respiratory tract, around your urinary tract, all these areas that are actually in direct contact with the outer world. You want to make sure that the connection between the cells is tight so that nothing actually gets in. And vitamin D actually upregulates, in other words, these genes, creates these proteins that make sure that there is this tight connection so that viruses don't get in, so that bacteria don't get in, so that toxins don't get in. And so that's how vitamin D helps. It also amazingly, just non-specifically again, activates chemicals that kill bacteria on the skin. So if you don't have vitamin D, the junctions between these cells can be open. So they're like open, like my fingers, and things can pass through. And as a result, you can end up getting an infection. So you want to make sure that those things are as tight as possible. It also enhances the formation of peroxide. Now, many of you probably don't know, but when your body is trying to kill certain things that have gotten in, it actually forms peroxide in your cells and outside your cells to kill things. And vitamin D is there to enhance that secretion. And amazingly, when you are being attacked or something penetrates, your body does its best to sort of seal it off, and it does that by recruiting all these cells which cause inflammation. But unfortunately, in a lot of people who don't have, just in general, you can have, anytime you have any kind of inflammation, you can have too much inflammation. And if you have too much inflammation, that can be a problem. Now, with the current pandemic that we're dealing with, you may have heard of this thing called cytokine storm, where people, unfortunately, their body overreacts. And that can be something that can really lead people to get very, very sick with what we're dealing with now. And vitamin D actually prevents the excess inflammation that comes with any kind of inflammation. And that's why people theorize that, we'll get into the statistics, but I think many of you probably know, but when your vitamin D level is normal, your risk for getting the virus is much, much less. There's like an 80% increased risk of just getting the infection if your vitamin D levels are low. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. So the main effect is boosting this innate immunity. And if you can really just shore up your first line of defense by optimizing your vitamin D levels, that's one way, of course, then you're really going to be in a good situation. And, I'm probably going to say this more than once, but everyone who's listening tonight should know what their vitamin D level is. If you don't know, then there are lots of ways for you to find out what it is. You don't even need to go to your doctor anymore. You can go to Amazon and you can buy a kit that you just stick your finger and you put a blot of blood onto, a piece of paper, like a blotting paper, and you send it in, and you can get your vitamin D level. We'll talk about what the number should be as we go on tonight, but everyone should know what that is, especially given the situation that we're in. And I'm hoping that by the end of tonight, you'll have not only I'll be giving you the information about that, but also that you have some understanding of why it's so important. And I'm hoping that you'll feel confident that it is important for you to optimize your vitamin D levels. And we'll talk also how to do that. But isn't it amazing that all of these first lines of defense are shored up, are reinforced, are strengthened by vitamin D? So it's super important for you to make sure you know your level. Now, adaptive immunity is like that general that I spoke about, right? He knows he's identified who the enemy is, and he's sending out these missiles that can identify the enemy. They're not going to target cells that are not the toxin or the bacteria or whatever the case may be. And vitamin D can also help that as well, but and does many things. But I think the best thing for you to remember is it really shores up that first line of defense especially well. Incidentally, just so you understand this, just as a basic concept, this adaptive immunity, this general deciding is able to identify these foreign elements that are coming into the body. Unfortunately, sometimes when it's unable to do that and it recognizes your own cells, unfortunately, that can happen. And that's what autoimmune disease is. And interestingly, because their vitamin D also has an effect on T cells, this adaptive immunity, unfortunately, when vitamin D levels are very low in a population, it's one of the factors that contributes to these higher levels of autoimmune disease. It's this general not being able to identify who's wrong and who's an enemy and who's the self. And so therefore vitamin D also has an impact on that as well. So when it comes to infection, it's been known for 100 years that vitamin D has been helpful for infection. That's why they had like solariums in these tuberculosis. What did they call the tuberculosis? What were they called? Yeah, like a tuberculosis ward or something like that. Anyway, they would have these solariums where they would, they would get sun, and the sun would raise their vitamin D levels. And it was known 100 years ago that would help with tuberculosis. But we've reviewed already that it triggers these amazing antimicrobial, what are called peptides, these chemicals that just act as antimicrobials. And these antimicrobials that are created, say, in the skin and other areas are really now actually being investigated because they're naturally kill bacteria. And as we're dealing with all kinds of antibiotic resistance, these are potentially going to be new chemicals that we can use. Again, we spoke about promotes the fact that the general can identify these foreign invaders. So this we would call acquired host defense. And vitamin D and upper respiratory tract infections. Now, the virus we're dealing with now obviously is an upper respiratory infection. And if we can reinforce those junctions, the cells, making sure they're tight, then of course that's going to be helpful. And vitamin D helps to facilitate that. But we've known for years that, there was a study done in Japan that school-age kids who took vitamin D had a significantly decreased risk for getting colds. And the virus that creates colds is not all that different from the virus that creates what we're dealing with today. And in Finland, military recruits who had low vitamin D levels had much more lost days. They were out sick a whole lot more if their vitamin D level was low. And these types of studies, these are not the only two. There are numerous studies, and we're talking just about upper respiratory tract infections, but when it comes to a whole host of things, including things like influenza, bacterial vaginosis, even HIV infection, in terms of infection rates, there are higher rates when vitamin D levels are low. And then again, to just mention again, because vitamin D is also there to what you could say is limit collateral damage. The inflammation that is all part of reacting to the environment creates all this inflammation, and you don't want there to be too much inflammation. And so vitamin D can sort of help make sure that the amount of inflammation that you develop from an infection is not crazy. It's not like going too much. So it's limiting the collateral damage of the inflammation. Okay, so now let's get into how to raise your vitamin D level. Now, first of all, you want to make sure that your level is greater than 40. And it should probably be under 150. Most people don't have that high of a level. If it's higher than 150, then there is a little bit of a risk for getting calcium in your urine, like getting calcium stones. But the risk is low even when it's above 150, but it has been reported above 150. So you want to have, if it's 40, it's fine, but you want it a little bit, 40 and up is what you want it. And again, everyone, all of you that are on this tonight should know what your vitamin D level is, and then work to get it above 40. And I can tell you that, unfortunately, remember I mentioned at the beginning that it's rare for me to see someone with a normal vitamin D level. It's not that those people weren't taking vitamin D. Some of them were. They just weren't taking enough, and they might not have been taking it the right form. You want to make sure that you're taking a gel cap, not those dry pills, because they don't absorb as much. And you need to wait, a month or 2 months or so to check. But you want to know what your baseline is. Unfortunately, when you're really vitamin D deficient, it's sort of like you're so deficient that the amount that you take it's like a bucket with a hole in it. You try to fill it, but your body is craving it so much because it's been so deficient that it just gets siphoned up, and the bucket doesn't fill up to a point where the level can stay low for a long period of time. So you have to wait a little bit to get the levels checked. And once you get the level normal, you have to obviously keep taking it, and periodically, at some point you can check once a year once you've gotten it to a certain level, and you sort of know how much you need to take and that sort of thing. Now, obviously, we're speaking about vitamin D supplementation, but what can you do besides vitamin D supplementation? Well, obviously, sun exposure is going to increase your vitamin D level. Unfortunately, a lot of us have gotten a little too much sun. And if you've had a lot of sunburns, it's probably not a good idea you're not going to get, it's probably not safe for you to get a lot of vitamin D from sun exposure. That being said, a number of us have had maybe too much sun on our face and maybe our hands or certain parts of our body. That doesn't mean that you couldn't get a little bit of sun, on your chest or back if you haven't had, lots of sun damage or sunburns, that sort of thing. Losing weight also can help raise your vitamin D level. It's sort of like, you could think of it as sort of a dilution effect. When you have a lot of body mass, unfortunately, you need more vitamin D to have adequate blood levels. And of course, there are some foods that contain vitamin D, but unfortunately, they don't really raise vitamin D all that much. So fish like salmon, herring, sardines can increase your vitamin D level a little bit, but we're talking about like a couple hundred international units, when most people need to take like 4,000 units, 4,000 or 6,000 units a day to get the levels where they need them. So you're not going to get a huge amount. Cod liver oil, was traditionally used. It has vitamin A and vitamin D and omega-3s. The problem with cod liver oil is you don't really know the ratio of vitamin D to vitamin A. It's sort of, you get too much vitamin A, there's an issue, there can be some health issues. So historically, obviously cod liver oil was very beneficial in northern climates and to provide vitamin D and fish oil and such. Unfortunately, these days you can do it a lot easier with select supplements to get those levels, because you don't really need to take vitamin A as a supplement if you have a well-balanced diet, and you don't want to have too much. Egg yolks have some, mushrooms have some as well. And then of course there are fortified foods now. There's orange juice and almond milk and all sorts of things that have vitamin D fortified. Some of those fortified foods, though, might not be the healthiest things in the world. So your best bet is obviously to eat as healthy as you can, maybe a little bit of sun exposure, very, very cautious with that, and to use a supplement. So we're coming to the end here, and basically the current situation that we're in is that, as I mentioned already, you're 80% more likely to get infected with the virus if your vitamin D levels are low. Now that is significant, 80% more likely. Additionally, vitamin D deficiency is associated with a much higher risk of hospitalization. And there have been many people who have thought that, in the African American community, the rate of hospitalization is many times higher than the rest of the population. And as I mentioned in the very beginning, the darker skinned you are, the less likely you are to get a good amount of vitamin D from the sun. And so therefore, it's super important to make sure that you don't have a vitamin D deficiency. And again, the easiest way is to take a supplement and know your level. I'm always amazed, again, that even Anthony Fauci recommends vitamin D, and he's one to not to necessarily recommend supplements and things like that, but even he takes vitamin D because he's probably seen the data. And I just hopefully you see that it makes sense, right? It makes sense that you want to reinforce that innate immunity, that ability to block out things that are going to harm you. And vitamin D is really going to shore up those defenses, make them stronger. You can think of it as those soldiers in the front line. They're like staying really tight and they're not letting anything by. That's what vitamin D is doing. There have also been some interesting charts that I unfortunately couldn't find to show you, but the death rate with the virus that we're dealing with is it basically goes to practically zero, no deaths when the vitamin D level gets to a certain normal value. So this is incredibly important, and I really think that you should have a general understanding of this. Now, it's important for you to understand what the other factors are here, and then we're going to close tonight's class. And what you're going to find is, again, that public health policy experts are going to tell you that, unfortunately, in general, when you look at vitamin D supplementation, there's a difference between reversing something with vitamin D supplementation. In other words, most of the studies basically are saying, well, if your vitamin D level is normal, then your risk is less. And if your vitamin D level, and vice versa, the opposite. And what public policy people will tell you is that the studies to show that vitamin D supplementation reverse that are mixed. And the answer to that is true. That is true. There is mixed results. But like I said before, it's because people are looking at it from the perspective of one particular ingredient without correcting other things. And vitamin D requires other things. We spoke about it already. Vitamin D requires vitamin K and magnesium. Now, this is a brief review, but we've spoken about how you first think of calcium metabolism, but deficiency is also associated, in addition to all those infections, with high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, left ventricular hypertrophy, and congestive heart failure is also associated. But as we've said, vitamin D supplementation does not reduce all-cause mortality. And that's why you'll see, even to this day, press reports that basically say that vitamin D does nothing. But unfortunately, they're missing a lot of things. One, we've spoken about why, of course, it helps with immunity, but what they're missing is a lack of understanding of why these two things work together. As an example, there's vitamin K, which is also involved with bones and cardiovascular health, as well as coagulating helping your blood coagulate. And deficiency is also associated with a higher cardiovascular risk. But the same thing goes when you try to correct it with vitamin K supplementation, the results are actually inconsistent. So what's going on here? What's going on here is there are certain types of proteins that get activated. And in this case, there is a certain protein that basically prevents calcification in your arteries. And when you have low vitamin K, there's this increased calcification. So there's a whole host of things going on. Now, what's happening is there's a connection between these two things, because vitamin D promotes the production of things that affect vitamin K. And when you do interventional studies and you actually combine D and K, you start to see results. And when you see low D and low vitamin K, then you have increased risk of all these things that we've spoken about. So there are lots of studies that are basically showing that you really, when it comes to, in this particular case, cardiovascular health, you really need vitamin D and vitamin K together, or you're not going to see those types of results. Additionally, there's magnesium, and the link between vitamin D and magnesium is critical. Basically, magnesium is involved in vitamin D becoming active. And the vitamin D binding protein, remember how we spoke about how it's binding something, needs magnesium. And we also know that magnesium supplementation helps vitamin D status. So unfortunately, unless you're developing a study where you're tracking magnesium and vitamin K and vitamin D, you're really not going to be able to make grand conclusions. But we understand something now about how vitamin D works, and therefore incorporating understanding magnesium and vitamin K along with vitamin D is going to help with making sure that your vitamin D status is proper, is high. So the modern dilemma, of course, is that magnesium is probably the lowest it's ever been in the food supply. It's much lower than, we have data from the 1950s that show that just your average nuts, seeds, and vegetables are much lower in magnesium than they were in the 50s. And about 2/3 of the population in the US have inadequate intake, especially in people who are older than 70. So this is the dilemma. So how do you get magnesium? How do you get vitamin K? Because now you really need to be able to optimize those. So how do you do that? Well, honestly, there's two types of, let's talk about vitamin K first. Vitamin K, there's vitamin K1, which is found in vegetables. And then there's vitamin K2, which is found in fermented foods, as well as some things like cheese. I've spoken a lot about natto, this fermented soybean that has an incredible amount of vitamin K. Ideally, however, it's difficult to ensure that you get enough from your diet unless you really love natto. So you want to get a multivitamin that has both vitamin K1 and vitamin K2. Magnesium is found in nuts and seeds. One of my favorite sources of magnesium is cacao nibs. And raw cacao have a decent amount of magnesium. But ultimately, you could get your magnesium checked. It's a special test called RBC magnesium. But I recommend that people supplement with magnesium because everyone is deficient. And it would really be difficult to overdo magnesium. Epsom salt bath, as an example, you actually absorb some of the magnesium in the Epsom salt. So that's one way. But ultimately we need to, for most people, because it's very difficult to get from the soil has been so depleted. Unfortunately, you're not getting the same amount of magnesium you would normally get in things. So I see I'm getting a question from Kristen about how much. It's most supplements come in 250 or 500 milligrams, and there are many forms of magnesium. I probably would need to do an entire talk about that. Some work more for the brain, but most good multivitamins have some magnesium, but a separate magnesium supplement, you can try. There are multiple forms. Unfortunately, sometimes they can cause diarrhea, so sometimes you have to play around with different forms of magnesium to see which one you tolerate. And ideally, you would get a blood test, but you don't necessarily need to do that. But you do need to just realize that you need magnesium to activate vitamin D. And you need vitamin D and vitamin K together to get some of the benefits. And all of these three things are working in this incredible symphony that is going to ensure optimal cardiovascular health, optimal bone health, and of course, optimal immune health, like we've spoken about tonight. So that is really what I wanted to cover tonight. We essentially went through a whole host of things tonight. So just in summary, it's almost certain, unfortunately, that if you're not taking some sort of vitamin D supplement, that Kristen, I'll get to your question in just a minute. It's almost certain that if you're not taking vitamin D supplementation, the chances are you're vitamin D deficient, unless you're getting a lot of sun and you're eating a lot of salmon and mushrooms, like a huge amount. It's likely that most likely you are deficient from the things that we spoke about: urbanization and migration and a whole host of things. And the fact that we're not working out in the fields like we used to. We're working in an office, and we're not spending 20, 30 minutes out in the sun. That is what would be required, like almost full body sun exposure to get to that level. And even then, it's not a guarantee. They actually did a study of surfers in Hawaii who were surfing for a couple hours a day, and unfortunately, it got very, very dark. And then at some point, they weren't converting as much as you would expect, and some of them were like borderline deficient. So we had these clues that certain diseases occur at certain latitudes as a result. And then we spoke a little bit about how the challenge of trials. Now, in other words, you get these media reports that none of these vitamins work for anything, but we understand a little bit now about how difficult it is. Diseases are very, very difficult to track, and if you're expecting one vitamin to show some sort of medicinal magic bullet effect, it's an unrealistic expectation, and it doesn't take into account those things that we spoke about in terms of vitamin K and magnesium. Then we spoke a little bit about how vitamin D affects the immune system and how it shores up that first line of defense. And then we spoke about you want your levels, hopefully all of you remember, you want them above 40. And you really, again, you can order that yourself on Amazon, or you can go into a local lab. There are labs now all over the United States that allow you to order your own labs. And then we spoke about magnesium and K2 and how it's not a simple thing as just vitamin D. And to expect vitamin D, it's an unrealistic expectation for it to do everything. So that's what I wanted to cover tonight. Let's look at the questions. Kristen is saying that, I'll just read this out. Kristen says, I have severe asthma since childhood. I'm also darker skinned. I have osteopenia due to the corticosteroids I take for controlling my asthma. I moved from North to Central Mexico for my health, but I'm still having difficulty raising my vitamin D levels. And in Mexico, they do not sell vitamin D2. My family sends it to me from the US, and I take 50,000 international units once a week, but I'm still only at 28. What can I do? Well, obviously, you need to talk to your doctor. I can't make medical recommendations, but a few things here. The first is that actually vitamin D3 is more effective than vitamin D2. For whatever reason, there is a prescription vitamin D2. It allows doctors to write a prescription, but it's not more effective than taking vitamin D3. And for whatever reason, there is this perception that if a doctor writes a prescription for vitamin D2, that it is somehow more effective. But in fact, you're better off taking vitamin D3 in a gel cap and starting with 5,000 units. Now, the reason that of the big dose of 50,000 of D2 is because you need to be able to convert it in your body. With vitamin D3, it's already in its effective form. So I would recommend, I can't make medical, I shouldn't make medical recommendations, but I would tell you that, you know, you're in Mexico, so obviously you can get vitamin D3 in a local drugstore anywhere in Mexico. So you do not need D2. So I would take 5,000 units of D3 once a day, and in a month I would check your vitamin D level. And additionally, I would start taking a magnesium supplement. And make sure your multivitamin has some K2 so that the vitamin D that you're getting is activated properly. So that's what I would recommend. I think obviously everything you're describing can be potentially related to vitamin D. So you're saying now that there is that your so she's saying that her multivitamin has 16 milligrams. That's probably, you'll have to contact me afterwards. It's probably not enough. Looking at, let me look something up for you quickly here. 1 second. But certainly you can get, let me, just looking at something here for you. Yeah, Kristen, you can email me at my email address, no problem, which is jonathan@miraclenoodle.com. I'd be happy to, I can't seem to pull up what I wanted to pull up, but that's okay. So let me pull this up here, sorry. Okay. All right, let me stop sharing my screen. Okay, so I think we covered everything. Yeah, Kristen, feel free to reach out to me. I don't mind you doing that, but I would just go to your local drugstore in Mexico and grab some D3 in a 5,000 international unit dose, or 22,000, and take 2 or 3, and start doing that, and then let me know how things go. But send me an email, and I'm happy to guide you on some supplements that you can find there. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I hope that was. I hope all of you will go get your vitamin D level checked. You're welcome. Thanks for the positive comments, and hope everyone stays healthy. And I look forward to seeing you for episode 82 next week, Wednesday night. And I wish everyone good health and a good rest of the week. Good night, everyone.